Welcome. Welcome to the Positive Links Speaker Series. I'm Lindy Greer. I'm a professor in the M&O department and very excited today to introduce one of the most amazing scholars on the topic of diversity with us today. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to celebrate the reason we all are here, which is the Center for Positive Organizations. And I believe that we have a video that we would love to share with you right now to celebrate that.
Moments of greatness are all around us. Do you see them? It's when you're at your best. It's when your team or organization is at its best. Here at the Center for Positive Organizations, we seek to understand this greatness, to help you and your organization be at your best more often. Greatness is seen in the high-performing, ethical, and generous leadership found at all levels of an organization. It can be found in your workplace relationships and a career filled with purpose, meaning, and compassion. It's seen in resilient teams who buck the status quo to make a culture change. It's in organizations that make a positive difference in the world. Hundreds of researchers from around the world study these phenomena in a field of science founded here at the University of Michigan. And to this day, we remain the movement's central catalytic hub. We share this knowledge in inspiring and practical ways through innovative learning programs, events, resources, and organizational partnerships. In our diverse co-learning community of scholars, educators, students, and leaders, we give opportunities for individuals and organizations to find and grow their greatness. Together, we are building a new breed of organization, the positive organization.
Such important work. So for today, welcome again. For first-time attendees in particular, welcome to our community. We're so glad that you're here. We're also grateful for the sponsors of this series, including the University of Michigan Organizational Learning, the Sainer Leadership Center, the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, the Zell-Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, Lisa and David Drews, and Diane and Paul Jones. So for today, I am very pleased to introduce Lisa Leslie. Lisa is an associate professor of management and organizations at the Stern School of Business at New York University. Her research focuses on strategies for facilitating social justice and strong performance in diverse organizations. And these are such important topics at the heart of the core dialogues in society right now in terms of equity, in terms of diversity. And Lisa also actually shows up in the field as someone who lives up to these values. And this is very neat to have someone like that who's making change, not just in terms of her research, but how she engages as an editor of our journals, as a tenured faculty member, etc. So Lisa, I got to know her initially through her older research in conflict management and cross-cultural organizational behavior. And Lisa, throughout all her work, has published in the top journals in the field, including Academy of Management Review, Academy of Management Journal, Journal of Applied Psychology, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and Science. So she's basically covered them all for what we can do. She's won multiple awards for her research, including Best Conference Paper Awards and some very prestigious early career awards. She's a fellow of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology and was named one of the top 40 under 40 professors by Poets and Quants. She completed her AB in social psychology from Princeton and her MA and PhD in organizational psychology from the University of Maryland. Today, Lisa will share with us her most recent work on diversity initiatives and how to ensure that such initiatives actually allow the leveraging of diversity for positive consequences for organizations. Thank you, Lisa, so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Lindy, for that very kind introduction. And thank you so much, all of you, for coming today. I'm going to share with you program research I've been doing on understanding whether or not diversity initiatives are effective. I'm going to be presenting some evidence that diversity initiatives don't always work quite like they're supposed to, and then what is it we can do to try to make them more effective. So despite some progress, we know that organizations continue to struggle around issues regarding diversity and inclusion. So for example, women and ethnic and racial minorities continue to be underrepresented in organizations. They continue to suffer from career gaps, right? So they earn less money, they're less likely to be promoted despite doing the same kind of jobs and doing them equally well. They also continue to struggle with these feelings of exclusion in their everyday interactions in organizations. And solving this problem, creating more diverse and inclusive organizations, is really important for organizations. It's important because we know that, at least under the right circumstances, being diverse and inclusive can facilitate organizational performance. And we also know that if organizations are tackling this, they're creating more diversity and inclusion inside of organizations, that can also help to facilitate social justice, right, in the broader society. The way organizations have responded to these challenges, they've tried to go about solving this issue, is to implement diversity initiatives. So I define this as the implementation of one or more policies and practices that are designed to improve the workplace experiences and outcomes of target group members. These initiatives most often target women and ethnic or racial minorities, but they can target any range of groups that face pervasive disadvantage in the broader society. We know these initiatives are really common. So for example, some research suggests that about 93% of organizations do some form of diversity recruitment. About 95% of organizations have some form of diversity training. And all the organizations in the S&P 100 list a commitment to diversity on their websites. So here's the basic logic of how these initiatives are supposed to work. So an organization implements the diversity initiatives. The ultimate goal of that initiative is to make positive progress towards their diversity goals. So this means more representation of target group members, decreased gaps in career success between target and non-target groups, and increased feelings of inclusion, right, among target group members. And they do this by implementing a variety of different policies and practices that are each meant to facilitate diversity goal progress through slightly different mechanisms. So they might implement what are referred to as non-discrimination policies. So this might be something like really emphasizing the importance of merit in making pay and promotion decisions. It might be something like training to educate people about how to prevent implicit bias. And the idea here is these policies and practices, well, they decrease discrimination, they prevent bias, and in doing so, help the organization make progress towards their diversity goals. Another diversity practices you might call resource practices. This would be something like a diversity mentoring program. It might be something along the lines of an affinity group or an employee resource group. These kinds of policies and practices are meant to increase support and opportunities for members of target groups and therefore help make progress towards diversity goals. The final group of practices you might refer to as accountability practices. This might be something like appointing a chief diversity officer. It might be something along the lines of a grievance system where people can report instances of discrimination. These kind of practices increase monitoring and oversight for diversity-related processes and in turn, hopefully, will help make progress toward diversity goals. So all of this sounds simple enough, right? You're an organization, you care about diversity and inclusion, you implement one or more of these different practices, and good things happen as a result. It turns out it's actually not that easy, and there's some pretty good evidence that these initiatives often don't work like they're supposed to. Some relatively recent evidence for this comes out of Silicon Valley. There are a number of technology companies who implemented these really extensive diversity initiatives. They really sort of put their teeth behind this, and a few years later, they didn't really have much to show for it. So an article about Facebook specifically, they talked about how Facebook replaced its diversity numbers, which were only incrementally higher than they had been the year before, despite several internal initiatives, and a blog post that outlined what is usually known as the pipeline problem. So Facebook sort of said, you know, we tried to make progress, but there just weren't enough women and minorities out there, and nothing happened. In the same article, there were some reactions from members of minority groups and from women who said things like, after reading the Facebook thing, I did feel crazy. Are you kidding me? There's no talent. Who am I? Am I invisible? Do I not exist? I felt out of my mind. Right? So sort of suggesting that no, this really isn't just a pipeline problem. There's something, you know, trickier going on here. And this is certainly not to pick on Silicon Valley and not to pick on Facebook in particular. Lots of organizations struggle with these same kinds of issues. And in fact, there's some research evidence to suggest that this is a pretty common story. So there's been a lot of research that's looked at a variety of different diversity practices and compared organizations who either did or did not have this practice and then looked at what happened, right? Did this do things like decrease discrimination in the organization and increase representation? And these research findings are really mixed and just all over the place, even when looking at the very same practice. So for example, there's some research on diversity evaluations. So this is when an organization says that every year, managers in your formal performance evaluation, diversity and inclusion, and what you've done to facilitate is one thing that we're going to evaluate on. Some studies find that organizations who have these practices, well, it's associated with increased representation of target group members. That's good. But some studies find the exact opposite, right? Actually, companies that have this, they have worse representation than companies that don't have it. The same thing is true of diversity networking and diversity affinity groups. Some studies find they're associated with increased representation, and some studies find the exact opposite. They're actually associated with decreased representation. Now, things get even stranger and more confusing when we start talking about things like diversity training. So some of the studies find that when organizations have diversity training, it's associated with decreased discrimination against target group members, right? That's great. If these practices decrease discrimination, they should increase representation, right? No, actually also decrease representation. And the same thing is true only in reverse for diversity statements. Some studies find that this is associated with increased representation, right? That's a good study, a good thing, but some also find that they're associated with increased discrimination, right? That's a bad thing. So what these findings kind of suggest is that even when looking at the same practices, diversity initiatives at least sometimes not only fail to do what they're supposed to do, but they actually do the exact opposite. So these kind of surprising, complex, hard to understand findings really motivated me to take on a program research looking at, well, why is it that diversity initiatives don't always work like they're supposed to, and what can we do to try to make them more effective? So I'm going to share some of my research with you, and I'm going to do this in sort of 3 parts. So I'm going to start out with kind of a broad overview, thinking about, well, what are the range of unintended consequences that diversity initiatives can produce and what explains them? I'm going to move on to talking about some more specific examples of unintended consequences of diversity initiatives, specifically in the context of the implication of these initiatives for the gender pay gap. And this gives a nice example of some of the sort of complex and nuanced processes through which this can happen. And then finally, in the third part, I'll move on to strategies for improvement. Right? What are some concrete things that leaders can do to try to make diversity initiatives more effective? Okay, so let's start off talking a little bit about the kinds of unintended consequences diversity initiatives can produce. To do this, I need to start out with just some basic definitions and assumptions. In general, we can define unintended consequences as any unforeseen outcome of efforts to create change in organizations or in societies. We know that organizations can be pretty complicated, tricky places. They're comprised of individuals who interact with one another in these complex ways. Because of this, the idea that change initiatives might produce some unforeseen outcomes is not particularly surprising, and some have said this is pretty much inevitable, right? That you're going to see unintended consequences. If we think about this in the context of diversity initiatives, we know the intended consequence of diversity initiatives is positive progress towards diversity goals, right? More representation, more inclusion, reduced career gaps. So what this means is their unintended consequences include really any other kinds of effects they produce. Now, in justifying this definition, it's important to make one really important assumption I'm making clear, and that's that the leaders that implement diversity initiatives are doing so with good intentions, right? What this means is they really want to move the needle when it comes to diversity and inclusion. I'm not saying this always happens. There's certainly evidence that companies sometimes do this just window dressing so they can say they have an initiative, but it doesn't really mean anything. But in those situations, if the initiative doesn't work or has unintended consequences, right, that's not particularly surprising. So what I'm going to be talking about, because it's more sort of interesting and complicated, is when leaders do this with good intention, they want to move the needle, but the initiative nevertheless sort of fails to work like it's supposed to. All right, so I'm going to talk about 4 different kinds of unintended consequences diversity initiatives can produce, and these can be differentiated on 2 different dimensions. So first we can talk about whether the diversity initiative is affecting the intended outcome, right, the thing it's supposed to be moving, versus affecting some other kind of outcome. And we can also talk about the direction of the effect. Is it desirable? Is it something that companies would be excited and happy about, or is it undesirable, right, something they would like to try to avoid? So the first unintended outcome is backfire. Right? And this is when a diversity initiative has an undesirable effect, and it's having that undesirable effect on the intended outcome. Right? So diversity initiatives are supposed to increase representation of target group members, and they instead result in decreased representation. The second unintended consequence type I call negative spillover, and this is also an undesirable effect, but now it's having that undesirable effect on some outcome other than the intended outcome. So diversity initiatives are supposed to help target group members, and instead they're resulting in negative attitudes among non-target group members. So these unintended consequences are both uniformly undesirable, but we know that unintended consequences don't have to be negative. The concept of positive externalities in economics, some of you might be familiar with, would be an example of a positive unintended consequence. The same kind of thing can happen with diversity initiatives. So if a diversity initiative has a desirable effect and some unintended kind of outcome, that would be an example of positive spillover. So these initiatives are supposed to help target group members, but they might also have some beneficial effects on non-target group members. That would be an example of positive spillover. And then the last one is sort of the most complicated, and that's false progress, right? And so this is when a diversity initiative has the desired effect on the intended outcome, right? So it looks like the diversity initiative is working. But this happens when the diversity numbers improve, so it looks like things are getting better, but that improvement in the metrics and the numbers is not accompanied by true underlying change, right? The numbers look better, but nothing has really changed. So that's kind of a broad overview, but what I'll do next is go into each one of these in a little more detail and talk about sort of their nature and some of the mechanisms and root causes that produce them. And in doing that, I take basically a signaling perspective. This is rooted in the basic idea that whenever organizations implement some form of initiative, it sends these signals or these messages about what the organization is like, right? What's the culture? What are the values? What are the norms? What kind of behaviors are expected? And I provide some evidence that it's really these signals associated with diversity initiatives. The message that people are inferring are a root cause of a lot of these unintended consequences. So let's start with Backfire. So this is when a diversity initiative has an undesirable effect, right, on the intended outcome variable. A likely cause of these effects are the signal that targets need help to succeed. This is likely not a signal that a lot of organizations want to send when they implement a diversity initiative, but at the same time, it's pretty central to the definition of diversity initiatives, right? These initiatives are supposed to help target group members. People are therefore likely to infer, well, maybe target group members couldn't do it on their own. And this is problematic because it can lead to stereotyping and discrimination, right? We know the reason why target group members need extra help to succeed is because of systematic disadvantages they face in society. But people have a basic tendency to kind of ignore or underestimate the role of those situational explanations and instead infer, well, the reason why target group members need help was because they're not very competent, right? They don't have high enough ability. That increases negative stereotype, leads to discrimination, and can ultimately lead to backfire, right? It's a reason why you might see less diversity as a result of these initiatives instead of more diversity. And there's good evidence that this kind of thing happens in the context of lots of different diversity practices, whether it's diversity training, affirmative action statements, or something else. So negative spillover, again, occurs when you have an undesirable effect on something other than the intended outcome. And a likely root cause of these kind of effects is the signal that targets are likely to succeed. Now, this is a message that leaders probably want to send to people when they implement a diversity initiative, right? If targets are seen as more likely to succeed, they're likely more attracted to the organization that can help with diversity issues. But it's also likely to lead to some perceived unfairness among members of non-target groups, right? So whites and men, for example. And the reason this happens is that we know that people tend to perceive intergroup relations in a zero-sum manner. So what that means is if you present people with information that, you know what, minorities' experiences are really improving in this country or in this organization, well, people make the inference that that must mean things are getting harder for minority group members. So what this suggests is diversity initiatives signal not only that things are getting better for minorities, but things are going to be worse for majority group members, for the non-targets. They therefore see that as unfair. And ultimately, this leads to a lack of engagement, right? They form sort of negative attitudes toward the organization because they feel the organization is treating them unfairly. And also for this kind of effect, there's lots of evidence this sort of thing happens in the context of lots of different diversity policies and practices. In terms of positive spillovers, this is having a positive effect on something other than the intended outcome. These effects likely stem from the signal that morality is valued. So diversity initiatives are actually pretty different from a lot of organizational initiatives. They're often focused on an organization-specific problem, right? So you might have a restructuring initiative because you want to increase efficiency, for example, in the organization. Diversity initiatives are a little bit different. They can help solve organizational problems, but they're also relevant to facilitating social justice, right, in the broader society. And we have good evidence that people see this as a moral imperative, right? They see efforts to prevent discrimination, to facilitate fairness as being sort of morally righteous, which suggests that diversity initiatives may also send this signal that this is an organization which we really care about morality. We care about doing the right thing. That can lead people in turn to believe that in general the organization has a climate where ethical behaviors are normative and expected, right? So the values of the organization give you information about what's expected and what goes on here. If that's true, that can in turn lead to some positive attitudinal outcomes, right? Some positive increased engagement in the organization, not just among target group members who are the targets of the initiative, but also among non-target group members, right? Who sort of feel that this is a place where people act with good intentions, they act ethically, and therefore I'm going to sort of reciprocate with more positive attitudes and more engagement with the organization. There's not as much direct evidence that this kind of thing happens, but there are some hints of it. So there's a recent study that was not about diversity initiatives per se, but just about the level of diversity in an organization where they found that actually, yes, an organization more diverse, people see the organization as more moral, and there's also some evidence that when organizations have diversity initiatives, it can lead to some positive attitudes and reactions among non-target group members. And then finally, false progress. This is when a diversity initiative sort of improves the diversity numbers, but doesn't reflect any true underlying change. Likely cause of these effects, the signal that diversity goals are valued, right? You implement an initiative, it's relatively intuitive that people would see that as a signal the organization cares about diversity, and that's all well and good. But it can also provide people with an extrinsic, rather intrinsic incentive for trying to make progress towards diversity goals. So regardless of whether people think that diversity is inherently important, sort of personally, they're going to feel this external pressure, right? So there's reasons to focus on diversity, to try to create inclusion. And that can lead to false progress because it motivates people to take shortcuts. Right? So if you take a shortcut to make the diversity numbers look good without creating true change, that's a lot easier. That satisfies this external pressure. And it's also okay for you personally if it's not something that you feel is intrinsically important. There have been some sort of anecdotal accounts about ways in which this might happen, specifically in the context of diversity initiative. So people have speculated that in order to improve the diversity numbers, a manager might take a job where there are a lot of women or a lot of minorities and it's a non-managerial job and just reclassify it and say, okay, this job is now a managerial job and it looks like the representation in managerial positions has gone up, right? But nothing has actually changed. Another way you might be able to do this would be if you have a gender pay gap, you sort of strategically give big pay raises to just a couple of women. That gets rid of the pay gap in the aggregate despite the fact that a lot of women are still being underpaid in the organization. So we kind of put all this together, it looks something like this, right? Organizations implement diversity initiatives, and they send these various signals about what is the organization like, right? What's normative in this company. That in turn has some implications for people's psychology and behavior, right? How they think about diversity, how they treat members of target groups, and then it ultimately leads to these 4 different types of unintended consequences. I think there are a couple of implications of putting this all together in this way. The first is that these backfire and negative spillover effects are pretty well documented, and they've been documented in the context of lots of different diversity practices. And so what it suggests is there's some common sort of mechanisms or similar processes through which that are driving these effects as a result of lots of different diversity practices. It also helps expand our understanding because positive spillover and false progress have not been as well understood, but there's some decent evidence that these things do at times happen, right? These are likely consequences as well. And then finally, I think there's some implications associated with thinking about this from a signaling perspective. There's a lot of research that is focused on the different types of concrete practices that organizations implement. And I'm not saying that different practices don't matter, but what this kind of suggests is these signals are not specific to particular diversity practices, but they're messages and interpretations associated with just having a diversity initiative. So what it sort of suggests is a different perspective in the sense that, if diversity initiatives are sending these basic messages, the practices are a little bit less consequential in terms of understanding what the root cause of these effects are. But I think there's also an opportunity here from a practical standpoint. These signals are not concrete, but they're also something that leaders can control. So this might suggest that if a leader in an organization is worried about a backfire effect in the context of diversity initiative, well, they can take control of the message and say, we have this initiative, but the reason why targets need extra help is not because they lack compensability, it's because of these systematic disadvantages, right? And that may be able to help kind of cut off some of these backfire effects. Similarly, a leader could really emphasize that morality is valued, and that's a rationale for the diversity initiative, and that might help sort of increase positive spillover effects as a result of the initiative. Okay, so that's the really broad view. Next, I'd like to make this a little more concrete and talk about a specific project where I sort of get into, how does this play out? We're going to be talking about an example of false progress. And this is a project on, what happens and what are the implications of a diversity initiative, specifically for the gender pay gap. So as I'm sure many of you know, there's a gender pay gap. Overall, women earn about 80% as much as men earn. You can add lots of control variables, so work experience, education, all sorts of things that sort of legitimately affect pay. And the gap shrinks, but it remains significant, right? It shrinks so that women earn about 91% instead of 80% of what men earn. So that's fairly well documented. There's a gap in pay, there's a gap in promotion, right? Career success more generally. But against that backdrop, there's been some sort of interesting research that's emerged, some interesting findings that suggest that actually sometimes women get a premium instead of getting a penalty. So there's one study that was done in the context of academia. They looked at people who are on the academic job market, and they found that female applicants were actually preferred by a ratio of 2 to 1 over male applicants, everything else being equal. There's another study that was done of male and female CEOs, and after controlling for lots of things that affect pay, they found that actually female CEOs were paid more than male CEOs. So these findings are intriguing, but what they don't do is they don't help us understand, well, why is this happening? Why would women sometimes be getting a premium instead of a penalty? And also, when does this happen, right? How can we reconcile this abundant evidence that women receive a pay penalty with this emergent evidence that sometimes they actually get a premium instead? So those are the main questions that my co-authors and I set out to answer in this research project. And in thinking about this, these were our intuitions, our basic predictions, that the presence of diversity initiatives and organizations would create a pay premium for certain women. But this pay premium would only emerge for women who'd been deemed to have high potential, right? Meaning they already were in the upper echelons of organizations or have been deemed by other people as likely to get there. The reason why we thought this, we know diversity initiatives are really common, right? Organizations care about representation of women. We also know that overall women are pretty well represented in management. It's about 50-50 men and women. But that doesn't hold when we look at the highest levels of organization, right? So about 15% of executives are women and only about 8% of top earners are women. And so what this suggests is that, diversity initiatives with this lack of diversity at the top of organizations, that there's really high demand, right? A lot of organizations want these women who have the ability to get to the upper echelons. Basic principle, economic principle of supply and demand, the more greater demand for a resource, the higher its value and thus its price, right? To sort of suggest these women are being paid more due to this type of dynamic. So that's a very sort of high-level parsimonious explanation about why high potential women would be paid more than high potential men. We also have to keep in mind that for this to happen, these are decisions being made by individual managers. And so we wanted to dig in a little more, well, what's going on in the minds of these managers that would explain why women are being paid more than men, only when they have high potential. And our prediction that was because they're seen as having more diversity value to the organization. So the idea here is, diversity initiative signal is something the organization cares about. As an individual manager, when you see a woman who has the ability to get to those upper echelons of the organization, you form perceptions that this person has particular value to the organization, more so than a high potential man, and that you personally as a manager will be sort of rewarded for trying to retain this person and in turn pay them more, right? It's sort of a mechanism for doing so. And then our final prediction was, diversity initiatives create this female premium. It's unique to high potential women. It's driven by perception of diversity value. And we also expected that this premium would be larger, right? The gap between favoring women over men would be even larger in organizations that have stronger diversity initiatives, right? We know many organizations have them, but there's also some variability. Some organizations focus on more than others. And if diversity initiatives are really deriving these effects, we would expect the premium to be larger in those organizations. So we tested this basic idea in a series of 4 studies, and I'll tell you about them just quickly. So we started out in the field. We had some data from a Fortune 500 organization. We had information on about 1,000 employees. We had data on their gender. Potential was something that was rated by the organization as part of their formal annual review. People are rated as either 1, not high potential, a 2, likely to rise to sort of mid-level management in the organization, or a 3, super high potential, likely to rise to the highest ranks of the organization. And we also had data on their pay, base salary and variable pay. And we also had lots of control variables, right? So these things like education, work experience, performance rating, other things that would affect pay and maybe provide an alternative explanation. Consistent with a lot of prior work, we found an overall pay gap in these data. Women earned about 85% as men did overall. We threw in all those control variables, things that could explain differences, and the gap shrunk, but was still significant. Women earned about 95% as much as men. But the really interesting findings were when we looked at the combination of gender and potential, we found this pattern, right? So here we have people's potential ratings of 1, 2, or 3. The black line is women, the dotted line is men. And then we have their pay was the dependent variable. So when you look at people who are not considered high potential, we see a pretty typical gender gap. Women earn only 92% of what men earn. In this context, that was about $8,000. But when potential was high, the gap flips, and it was roughly equal in magnitude, right? So now women are earning 107% of what men earned. Now this graph looks nice and symmetrical, right? It looks like the pay penalty at low potential is the same as the pay premium at high potential. So you might be wondering, why is there a gender gap overall? But it's really important to remember that only about 60% of women, or a total of 60% of women are low potential, about 30% are mid potential, and it's only 10% that are high potential, right? So there are more women down there than are up here, which is why we see this overall gap in the data. Okay, so that was some support for our initial prediction. But we wanted to know, is this really causal? We wanted to provide a test of the mechanism. Is it perception of diversity value that are driving this? So we did a laboratory experiment. We got about 250 MBA students. We brought them into the laboratory. We told them, we want you to pretend that you are a manager of this company and you're going to be evaluating a lower level employee. They evaluated an employee who was either a man or a woman, use the name Sarah or Matthew. And we also manipulated their potential rating. Using that same scale in the prior study, we said they're a 1, a 2, or a 3. And then we asked them, how much value do you think this person would add to the organization from a diversity standpoint? And how much do you think we should pay this person? This is what we found. So these were the effects of gender and potential in predicting perceptions of how valuable they were for a diversity standpoint. And when potential was a 1 or a 2, right, there was no difference between men and women. But there was a significant difference when potential was rated as 3, right? The high potential women were seen as adding more value to the organization from a diversity standpoint relative to the men. We then did a mediation analysis to see, well, do these differential perceptions explain any pay difference? And this was only true in that high potential women, but women were seen as more valuable from a diversity standpoint than the men, and that in turn explained how much people paid them, so that overall people were willing to pay the woman more than the man, only when potential was high, again, due to these perceptions that they were seen as more valuable from a diversity standpoint. So for our third study, we went back to the field. We wanted to test this idea, well, if diversity initiatives are really driving this effect, right, it should be stronger in companies that place more emphasis on diversity. So for this study, we had access to an archival data set of about 9,000 top executives. It was the top 5 or 6 highest paid executives in all companies in the S&P 1500 between 1992 and 2006. Again, we had data on their gender. In this case, these were all C-suite executives. They were all high potential, right? They'd already made it to the highest levels of organizations. And we had information on their pay as well as a whole bunch of control variables. We did not have a direct measure of how much the companies emphasized diversity, but we did know what industry they were in. And there's pretty conclusive evidence that organizations in the consumer goods and products industry put more emphasis on diversity relative to companies that are in the manufacturing industry. And this is likely because there's more face value to the business case for diversity in consumer goods and products, right? You have to have a diverse workforce in order to know how to design goods and services that are appealing to a diverse set of customers. So we use that as our proxy, right? Our sort of rough approximation of the extent to which companies focused on diversity. So in these data, sort of replicating some prior findings, we found that after putting all the control variables in, that women were paid more than men, earned about 110% more. But that pay premium for women varied significantly across different industries. So here, the black lines, the black bars are women, the gray ones are men. Goods is the consumer goods industry, services is consumer services, and manufacturing is manufacturing. And what we found in consumer goods and services, these high potential men were paid more than men. Women were paid more than men. They were paid 122% as much. In services, they were paid 115% as much, whereas in manufacturing, it was non-significant. So at least to the extent that you buy that industry is a good proxy for the strength of diversity goals, is supported the hypothesis that this premium would be larger in companies that put more emphasis on diversity. And then finally, for our final study, we returned back to the laboratory. We wanted to provide a more direct test of this idea that when diversity goals are stronger, we see this larger premium. So we used a design that was similar to our second study. We recruited people from an online panel, so lots of diverse work experiences. We again told them they were a manager in an organization and they'd be evaluating one of their subordinate employees. We again told them that it was either a man or a woman. This time we also kept potential high, so everyone in the study was a high potential. And then finally, we manipulated whether or not the organization had an emphasis on diversity. So in one condition, we told them this organization really cares about fostering diversity and inclusion. We had one control condition where we just omitted that information. But then we wanted to make sure that this is specific to diversity initiatives and not just about providing some additional information. So we had a second control condition in which we told them, this organization has a big merit-based initiative, right? We really care about making fair pay and promotion decisions. And then we again measured perceptions of diversity value and pay. And so here's what we found. So here's how the women versus men were perceived, right, in terms of their diversity value. The black bars are women, the gray ones are men. And we compare this in the diversity condition as compared to those two control conditions, which we collapsed because there were no differences. And what we found was actually a significant difference in both conditions. Women were consistently seen as higher in diversity value, these high potential women, as compared to the high potential men, but this effect was significantly larger. Right? The difference between men and women was even bigger when we told them that the organization had a diversity initiative as compared to when we did not. And then again, we did a mediation type analysis to sort of further dig and understand, what are the perceptions that explain this. And we found that, again, among these high potential men and women, particularly when the organization had diversity goals, women were seen as higher in diversity value. That led the participants, the assumed managers in this study, to feel that they would personally be rewarded, right, for sort of efforts to retain these women, and then they ultimately paid them more as a result of it. So to kind of sum this up, what we found is that diversity initiatives, right, produce this pay premium for certain women, but it only occurs for women who've been deemed to have high potential, so likely to rise to senior ranks or sort of already there. It's due to these perceptions that managers see them as having more value to the organization from a diversity standpoint, and they will personally be sort of rewarded for trying to retain them. And it's also larger, right? The pay premium for women is even bigger in organizations that place a stronger emphasis on diversity. So I've talked about this paper. It was published a few years ago, and I get two opposite polarized reactions whenever I talk about it. On the one hand, some people say, well, this is a market reality. To retain these women, companies have to pay them more. And moreover, not only is it a reality, it's a good thing. Right? We've got these highly paid women. They're in these senior roles. They're going to serve as a role model for other women. They're going to help further shatter the glass ceiling. This is a good thing for diversity and inclusion. Right? So that's one perspective. The other reaction I get is, well, women are not a protected group. Gender is a protected class. And what that means is that discrimination is discrimination, regardless of whether it's men versus women, right? They're sort of benefiting from the injustice, right? So I'm a researcher, I'm a scientist. I feel that my job is to be as objective as possible, so I don't take a stance on whether this is good or bad. But whether you see it as beneficial or detrimental, I do think it's an interesting example of the ways in which diversity initiatives can produce unintended consequences. Diversity initiatives are supposed to reduce pay gaps, and this does this, right? So the pay gap is going to be smaller if high potential women are being paid more than high potential men. But I would argue that it's not doing it in the way that diversity initiatives are supposed to work, right? What you would want to see is, regardless of potential, men and women coming closer in terms of their salary, right? So they're being paid the same amount. What we see happening here instead is just this more complex pattern of inequity, where most women who don't have high potential are being paid less, and it's only this small subset of women at the top who are actually being paid more. I'd also argue that the mechanisms of this more specific example are largely consistent with what I talked about earlier. Just generally this idea that having a diversity initiative signals this is something that the organization cares about, right? That these women have particular value to the organization, and it creates this extrinsic incentives. People feel that they will be rewarded for retaining high potential women that ultimately leads to this complex pattern of inequity. All right. So far we've been talking a lot about the problem, so I'd like to shift gears a little bit and start talking about the solution. Through my research and thinking about these issues, I've really come to the conclusion that these signals and messages, which are very subjective, you can't see them, play a large role in understanding why diversity initiatives don't work quite like they're supposed to. And on the one hand, that's challenging, right? We can't see these perceptions, these signals, these messages. They can be difficult to combat. But it also creates an opportunity. So in this newest project, which is very much still a work in progress, what my co-authors and I wanted to look at is, well, is there an opportunity to take control of the messages and the signaling around diversity initiatives? And maybe if leaders start talking about diversity initiatives in certain ways, that can be a way to help make them more effective, right? Taking control of the message, taking control of the signals. And so what we looked at in this project in particular is what we call diversity rhetoric, right? So how do leaders and organizations talk about diversity and its consequences when trying to justify diversity initiatives? So I'd like to get you guys involved in the conversation for a minute here. So if we could just start, if you could raise your hand if you currently work or have worked in the past for an organization that has some form of diversity initiative. Just raise your hands nice and high. Good, you guys are still awake. Most of the room, right? Most of us have. So I'd like to hear from just a couple people, when you were in that organization or currently in the organization, when leaders try to sell a diversity initiative, what kind of rhetoric do they use? What do they talk about? What reasons do they give for why you have a diversity initiative?
More like the community.
So you look more like the community, okay. I think we've got some microphones.
Yep.
You can throw them, it's fun for everybody.
It's a business initiative. It's not black and white, it's green.
Okay, it's good. It increases profitability.
Right.
Okay, what are some other, maybe just a couple more justifications that companies give? Match the community, good for business. We've got one back there.
That it creates stronger teams.
Creates stronger teams, okay. Good for organizations in that way. Anybody got something different? One more, we got one right here.
And it helps you reach a diverse customer base and constituency.
Okay, diverse customers, good for business. What about the moral implications? I mean, just go back to hands again. Do any leaders talk about moral imperatives? It's good, the right thing to do. Okay, a couple hands. So I'm hearing some combination of it's good for business, reach different customers, better teams, and it's the moral right thing to do. Does that more or less cover it? Anything fundamentally different we're missing? Okay. So there's been some research on this issue, and in particular, what happens when leaders provide these kind of justifications, right? Either a business justification or a moral justification for why we should focus on diversity and inclusion. And they're really just a handful of studies. The findings are not entirely consistent, but what it would kind of suggest is that, yeah, when companies provide these justifications, it tends to increase support for diversity initiatives. For some people, maybe one versus the other, but generally they both seem to maybe have at least some impact. But what I think is interesting about these two explanations is that, yes, they're different, but they're also kind of similar, right? They're both suggesting that there's some value in diversity, and that value might come from business reasons, it might come from moral reasons, but the basic idea is that diversity is valuable, and therefore that's why we should have this initiative. And I think there's some reason to question whether this message of diversity is valuable. It's really the most effective message if you really want to get people on board with diversity initiatives. And the reason why I think there's some reason to question this comes from research on the diversity performance linkage, right? So a lot of you are putting out there the business case, right? Diversity is good for the performance of organizations. Well, it turns out this is something that lots and lots of researchers have studied, right? They look at how diverse versus not an organization or a team is, and they look at how well that team performs. Now, based on the business cases, what leaders are putting out there, this should be a positive relationship, right? More diversity, better performance, right? No, it's zero, right? So the correlation, the association, on average, is almost exactly zero. Sometimes it's a little bit negative, sometimes it's a little bit positive, but there are meta-analyses, studies of studies, thousands and hundreds of thousands of teams and organizations, and overall, it's essentially zero. Now, one important thing about the zero relationship is that it masks a lot of variability, right? So what that means is that sometimes diversity is pretty bad, right? People who are different from another, sometimes it's hard for them to get along, they have conflict, there's tension, that's ultimately bad for performance of the team or the organization. But then sometimes diversity is great. Right? Sometimes you're exposing people to different perspectives, there's more innovation, there's better decision making, and that's really great for organizational performance. So we know that sometimes it's bad and sometimes it's great, but research has also uncovered a lot of the conditions that help us understand, well, when is it more likely to be good than bad? And so it's things like if you have an organization with collectivistic norms, right, where people are focused on the good of the group instead of their own individual needs, well, then diversity is more likely to be beneficial. If you have a transformational leader who really inspires people to achieve their best, right, diversity is more likely to be good than harmful. If you have people in a team and an organization who engage in effortful cognition, right, they're really thoughtful, they're open to experience, diversity is more likely to be good than it is to be harmful. And this is research at sort of the team level and organizational level of analysis. But actually, there's research that suggests something very similar at the individual level of analysis, right? So what happens when two people, let's say from different racial groups, interact with one another? Does that go well? Is the interaction smooth? Does it do things like reduce prejudice? And the answer is sometimes, right? That interaction is more likely to be beneficial, to add value for the individuals if there are things like equal status in the situation, right? If there are cooperative norms, if people engage in perspective taking and really try to see things from other people's point of view. So, as a lot of you suggest, what we hear a lot in organizations is that diversity is valuable for business or moral reasons. But the reality is a little more complicated, right? Sometimes diversity is really valuable. Sometimes diversity is really challenging. And if we want to reap the value and the benefits of diversity, it requires a lot of hard work, right? You have to create the right kind of situations, get people in the right mindset in order for diversity to be beneficial. So what we wanted to do in this project is sort of building from the reality of diversity in organizations is thinking about and looking at 3 different ways that leaders might talk about diversity, right? Different types of rhetoric they might use. So the first is value and diversity. This is probably the most common one, right? Just the idea that diversity adds value for either business or moral reasons. The second was, challenge and diversity, mirroring these effects that sometimes diversity creates problems. This is the idea that leaders emphasize that this is challenging, it creates tensions, right? It can be sort of problematic. And then finally, we propose looking at this idea of contingent diversity rhetoric, right? And this is the idea that leaders might emphasize that diversity can be really valuable, but it takes a lot of hard work to get there, right? So sort of more colloquially, the 3 ways of talking about diversity, the way I've come to think about them is value and diversity is good, challenge and diversity is bad, and contingent diversity is good, but also really hard. And on this project, we wanted to look at, first of all, which way of talking about diversity is more common. but then also which one is likely to be most effective. In terms of which is most common, we expected value rhetoric to be more common than contingent rhetoric, which would be more common than challenge rhetoric. The main reason for thinking about it this way is that we know that people are very hesitant to say negative things about other people and other groups due to something called negativity transfer. Right, so this is the basic idea. If I'm telling you guys about my friend Bob, and I talk about just how terrible and awful he is at everything, you'll see him more negatively, but you also see me more negatively, right? So that negativity transfers to me. So I should qualify that Bob is wonderful and lovely, and you guys would love him if you had a chance to meet him. And people know this, right? People know that when they say bad things about other people or groups, it transfers to them. And because of that, people tend to omit negative information. They just don't mention it as a way to sort of a self-presentational type strategy. This is true not only in general, it's also true specifically to diversity. There's this qualitative study that was done in sociology that I just really love by Bell and Hartman, where they went out and they asked people, what does diversity mean? And what are your experiences with diversity like? And people's first reaction is, well, diversity is broad, it means differences in everything, it's just so wonderful, it adds so much value, love it, it's great. But what they found is when they pushed people a little further to be more concrete and specific, they gave a different answer. And they said, well, actually, diversity is often a code word for things like gender and race, and actually, I have some kind of negative experiences around it, right? It creates some challenges and creates some difficulties. But again, specifically in the context of diversity, you're just reinforcing this idea that people are really hesitant to talk about the negative. For that reason, we expected value, sort of universally positive rhetoric to be most common, followed by contingent, which suggests that diversity is good, but also hard, so just some of that negative perspective on it. And then the least common would be challenge, which is that diversity is bad. So that's what we expected in terms of descriptively most common, but we expect that to be a little bit differently in terms of prescriptively, how should leaders be talking about this? We expected that overall, talking about how hard and challenging diversity is would have a negative impact. And particularly the kinds of outcomes we're interested in were things like, how much people support the diversity initiative and how much are they personally willing to put forth effort to facilitate diversity inclusion. So things like speaking up about discrimination, right? Being willing to give extra resources to minorities and other target groups. So if you're trying to sell a diversity initiative, get people on board with it, and you tell them it's really challenging and hard, that's not going to be very effective, right? We know from persuasion research that a bad argument is not going to persuade people. We thought that value rhetoric overall would be beneficial because that's a pretty strong argument, right? You want people to get on board with the initiative. You're telling them it adds value for business reasons, for moral reasons. That's a pretty strong argument. That should increase things like support for the initiative and people's own diversity efforts. But the more interesting prediction is we thought that contingent rhetoric would actually have the strongest beneficial effects. This is also consistent with some research on persuasion. It's looked specifically at what are called two-sided messages. All right, so I'm trying to persuade all of you guys to do something. I could give a one-sided message and just talk about how great it is, whatever it is I want you guys to do. Or I could do a two-sided message where I could talk about, well, here's why it's great, but here are some challenges. And the research is pretty clear that those two-sided messages are more persuasive. People find that more compelling than the one-sided message. And this happens for a variety of reasons. Part of it is if you mention the downsides, you're just seen as more credible. But part of it just is novel and surprising, right? It's sort of unexpected. This body of research also suggests that two-sided messages are particularly effective if they're refutational in nature. So what that means is you would tell someone, well, here's the upside, here's the downside, right? And here why all the upsides outweigh the downsides. Here's why there's not a big concern. Contingent diversity rhetoric is not exactly refutational, but it has sort of a similar flavor to it. Because basically you're saying, well, here's the good about diversity, it adds value. Here's the bad about diversity, it's kind of hard. But if you're willing to work through those challenges, well, that's when you'll reap all these wonderful benefits. So we thought this would actually be the most effective in terms of increasing people's attitudinal behavioral support for diversity initiatives. All right, so again, we tested this in a series of studies. I'll tell you about them just sort of briefly. This is still very much a work in progress, but I'll share with you guys what we have so far. In our first study, we decided to look at, well, how do companies talk about this on their websites? So we went to the websites of the Fortune 100, we downloaded the diversity web pages, and we quoted them. Right? We looked for any statements that are about the consequences of diversity, and we quoted them as reflecting value rhetoric, challenge rhetoric, or contingent rhetoric. And this is what we found. We found that on average, and this is in progress, we're not done yet, but on average, these companies have about 2.7 statements on their website, not quite 3, that talk about the effects of diversity, and 90% of companies have at least 1. In terms of quoting them specific kind of rhetoric, the vast majority of them reflected value rhetoric, so 90% of companies had at least 1 statement that emphasized the value in diversity. On average, these companies had about 2.6 of these statements on their website. No one talked about diversity as being challenging, not particularly surprising. And we found, some support, but a lower base rate for contingent, right? About 10% of companies had this kind of language. That was about 0.1 statements per company web page on average. So to support this basic idea, the yes value seems to be the most common, followed by contingent and then challenge. But there's some limitations of this, right? So this is how companies talk about diversity when they're sort of facing out to the world. That might be very different how they talk about it internally with their own employees. So their next step, what we wanted to do was go out and ask people, how do leaders talk about diversity in your organizations, and to what extent do you support these diversity efforts? So to do this, we had to come up with a bunch of different items to measure these different kinds of ways of talking about diversity. So for example, to measure value rhetoric, we would ask people, when talking about diversity, how much do leaders in your organization emphasize that diversity is beneficial, would be value, diversity creates problems, would be an example of a challenge item, and everyone needs to work hard on diversity for diversity to benefit an organization, would be an example of contingent diversity rhetoric. This sounds easy, you create these items, you go out, you ask people, right, you measure these different ways of talking about diversity. From a research standpoint, it's actually quite tricky, because researchers care a lot about construct validity, which is basically we need to make sure that what we think we're measuring, right, is what we're actually measuring. So there's a lot of work that has to go into this behind the scenes. Give people these definitions of the types of rhetoric, the items. You say how well do they match. You have to make sure people can actually differentiate among these different ways of talking about diversity. You have to make sure you're not reinventing the wheel, and these aren't just kind of existing constructs we already know about. I'm not going to go into all the details of that. I'll just tell you that we did it all, right? It looks good. You can feel pretty confident. We have construct validity, and we're actually measuring with these measures, what it is we think we're measuring. Okay, so then in our third study, we used an online panel. So we sampled people who worked at lots of different organizations, lots of different jobs, lots of different industries. And we asked them, when talking about diversity issues, which of these kinds of rhetoric do your leaders use? So we showed them those items. And here is what we found. So this was a 1 to 7 scale. Okay, so 1 is strongly disagree, 7 is strongly agree. Value rhetoric was most common. So 5.74 people not quite agreed, right, that leaders talk about diversity this way. Followed by contingent, a score of 5 corresponds to slightly agree. So people a little more than slightly agreed that leaders talked about diversity using this contingent rhetoric. And then 2.79 is a little less than slightly disagree, somewhere between slightly disagree and disagree. So that kind of rhetoric was not particularly common. So again, sort of reinforcing this pattern, value rhetoric is most common, then contingent, then challenge. And then in this study, we also asked people both, how much do you support diversity initiatives, and how much effort do you personally put forth in terms of facilitating diversity and inclusion? And they wanted to look at which of these kinds of rhetoric, right, predicted support and effort. So for support, or for all of these, but I'll start with support, we did this in a sort of 3-step process. So we first said, well, let's just look at these 3 kinds of rhetoric. That's the only thing we put in our model. Do they affect initiative support? No effect of using value rhetoric. That didn't have any impact on people's support. When leaders use challenge rhetoric, they said diversity is really challenging. People supported the initiative less, not surprisingly. But we found this positive effect of contingent rhetoric. When people said that diversity is valuable, but we have to work through the challenges, that increased how much people supported the initiative. Now, these are correlational data, so there's lots of alternative explanations. So we also wanted to test this in a more rigorous way, controlling for other things, right? There might be something about a person that makes them say, yes, I think leaders emphasize the value of diversity, and I also support this initiative, but it's not really a causal relationship. So in the second step, we put in a bunch of control variables to account for that. And here we didn't find our results changed at all. And then finally, in the third step, we felt this was the most stringent test. We asked people not only, how do your leaders talk about diversity, but what are your personal experiences with diversity like? And we thought that would be sort of the strongest evidence to see just how leaders talk about diversity matter over and above people's own personal experiences. And for diversity support, we found no evidence that it didn't. Okay, so some evidence that these types of rhetoric matter, but it was not particularly robust. We also did the same analysis looking now at diversity effort, right? How much effort do people put forwards? And our first is kind of basic test. Again, no effective value. Challenge rhetoric had a negative effect on people's rhetoric, whereas contingent effects had a positive. In our second step, we added these control variables and more stringent tests. The effect of challenge went away. The effect of contingent did not. And then finally, controlling people's personal experiences, we found that this positive effect of contingent rhetoric holds. Okay, so some decent evidence, and when leaders emphasize that diversity is good but hard, people work harder to support diversity and inclusion. There's some limitations to using online samples, so we went out and decided to replicate this. This time it was a company that we were consulting with. My collaborators and I, a large agriculture company, were able to sample about 2,000 people from their North American headquarters. We followed the same methodology. In terms of what kinds of rhetoric were most common, the means were a little bit lower, but it was the same pattern. right? So value and diversity was the most common, sort of in between slightly agree and agree. Then contingent was a little less than slightly agree, that leaders use this kind of rhetoric. And then finally challenge was a 2, so people disagreed that leaders use that kind of rhetoric. So we've seen the same pattern here. And then we use that same analysis, 3-step analysis, to look at supports, the effect of these types of rhetoric on both supports for the initiative and effort. In the first step here, we found that all 3 types of rhetoric mattered. So value and contingent both had beneficial effects on supports. Challenge had a negative. When we add a bunch of control variables, those steps held. Then finally, that third step, including for people's own personal diversity experiences, there were positive effects of both value and contingent and no effect of challenge. We then also looked at diversity efforts using the same 3-step procedure. At first, everything was predicted, sort of in the expected direction. In the second step, again, the effect of challenge rhetoric fell away. And then finally, in the third step, it was only this impact of contingent rhetoric that remained significant on diversity effort. So overall, these findings give a pretty clear message about challenge diversity rhetoric. It's a bad idea, right? Leaders don't do it, not surprisingly, and when they do it, it hurts more than it helps, so that's pretty clear. But things are a little more complicated when it comes to value versus contingent. So on the one hand, leaders tend to like value rhetoric, right? This is how they talk about diversity in organizations. It's the most common, but it's not necessarily the most effective, particularly if you care about people's behaviors, right? If you want them to engage in the kind of behaviors that facilitate diversity and inclusion, actually contingent rhetoric, it seems like it's a better way to go. So to wrap up, I want to leave you guys with a couple thoughts. One, hopefully this presentation has underscored that diversity initiatives don't always work like they're supposed to. They often not only do what the intended effect is, but sometimes they do the exact opposite, right? They produce these unintended effects. And a key reason for this is rooted in these kind of basic messages or signals that they send, right? It provides some information about the organization and what it's like. And these are drivers of unintended effects. On the one hand, that's problematic. These signals are hard to see. If you can't see them, they're hard to combat. You never know exactly how people are going to be interpreting these things in their heads and the message they'll be making up. But it also affords an opportunity, right? Leaders have the opportunity to take control of the messaging, to be really thoughtful about how they talk about and try to justify diversity initiatives. And on that specific point, I want to leave you with just one last takeaway. I want to acknowledge this is going to be a little controversial. Some people are probably not going to like what I have to say, and I do feel slightly uncomfortable realizing that this is part of the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarship. But I'm going to say it anyway because I think it's really important, so just bear with me. When leaders talk about diversity in organizations, right, this is what we all hear. Diversity is good. It's not true. Diversity is not good. If that's the message you're hearing or pervading in organizations, you're not accurately reflecting a more complex reality because it's not universally true, right? And that more complex reality is that diversity is good, but hard, right? This might seem like a minor qualification. It might also seem kind of obvious. So I'm pretty sure that if before my talk I had told you guys this is the punchline, this is what I'm going to tell you, a number of you probably would not have shown up because you would have thought, yeah, I already know that. Good but hard. Great. Thanks. Kind of obvious. But deep down, right, a lot of us, I think we know this, right? This is kind of our reality. But at the same time, we're afraid to say it. So one last thought I'd like you to leave you with is it's hard to do, but I think we should not be afraid to admit that diversity is both good and hard. That's not only a more realistic picture of the effects of diversity in organizations, but it's also more likely to take us where we want to go in terms of facilitating more diversity and inclusion. So with that, I just want to be sure to thank my wonderful collaborators without whom this research would not be possible. Colleen Manchester, who is my former colleague at the University of Minnesota, Patty Dom, who is one of my former students now at Cal Poly, and my 2 wonderful and amazing current doctoral students at NYU, Eleanor Flynn and Olivia Foster-Gibble. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. On behalf of the Center, a token of our appreciation, a positive spiral. And we hope to see all of you next time in a month for Patricia Hewlin and Authenticity. See you next time. Thank you again.